There's a photograph from 1895 that captures something extraordinary. A 250-room mansion lit by thousands of candles on Christmas Eve, its French Renaissance towers rising against the Blue Ridge Mountains like a fairy tale dropped into the Carolina wilderness. The richest family in America had built the largest private home the country had ever seen. 35 years later, that same family would be selling tickets to strangers just to keep the lights on. This is the story of how an empire built on railroads and steamships crumbled under its own weight, and how one massive house became both a symbol of American ambition and a monument to its cost. The Commodore's fortune. To understand how the Biltmore came to be, you have to understand where all that money came from in the first place. The Vanderbilt story begins not with mansions and champagne, but with a Dutch farming family living modestly on Staten Island. For generations, they were just another hard-working immigrant family. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary. Then came Cornelius. Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt was born in 1794, and he had something his ancestors hadn't possessed: an almost inhuman drive to succeed. He started with a single ferry boat at age 16, borrowing $100 from his mother to buy his first vessel. He worked that ferry himself, transporting passengers and goods around New York Harbor, operating in all weather, building a reputation for reliability that few could match. While other men were content with modest success, Cornelius kept expanding. He didn't just run one ferry, he built a fleet. He didn't just serve one route, he dominated the entire New York waterfront. By his 30s, he was a millionaire, which was extraordinary wealth in the 1820s. Then he saw the real future: steamships. Cornelius moved aggressively into steam-powered vessels, understanding that they would revolutionize transportation. He built steamship lines that connected New York to other East Coast cities, then expanded to California during the gold rush, running ships to Central America where passengers would cross by land before boarding another Vanderbilt ship to San Francisco. He made a fortune from the gold rush without ever mining an ounce of gold himself. But Cornelius wasn't finished. In his 60s, when most men were thinking about retirement, he sold his steamship empire and moved into railroads. He understood that railroads would be even bigger than steamships. He consolidated competing rail lines, created the New York Central Railroad, and built a transportation network that connected the entire Northeast. He was ruthless in business, crushing competitors, bribing officials when necessary, doing whatever it took to win. People feared him, but they also respected his business acumen. By the time Cornelius died in 1877, he had amassed a fortune of $105 million, more than the entire US Treasury held at the time. To put that in perspective, if you adjust for inflation and compare it to the size of the American economy, then versus now, Cornelius Vanderbilt was worth more than $6.2 billion in today's money. He was, without question, the richest man in America, and possibly the richest private citizen in the world. His wealth exceeded that of the Astors, the Rockefellers of that era, everyone. But Cornelius made a decision that would shape everything that followed. When he died, he left the bulk of his fortune, $95 million of it, to just one of his 13 children, his eldest son, William Henry. The Commodore had deemed most of his younger sons wastrels, unworthy of managing the family business. Only William Henry, he believed, had the intelligence and discipline to preserve and grow the Vanderbilt empire. William Henry proved his father right. In the 8 years between inheriting the fortune and his own death in 1885, William Henry not only preserved the empire, he doubled it. By the time he died, William Henry Vanderbilt was worth over $200 million, making him the richest man in America in his own right. His wife had spent those years working the social angle, trying to overcome the fact that the Vanderbilts were still considered new money by New York's old aristocratic families. The strategy was working. The Vanderbilts were becoming American royalty. William Henry had 8 children who survived to adulthood, and unlike his father, he divided his fortune among them. Each received millions. His eldest son, Cornelius II, netted $70 million. William Kissam Vanderbilt inherited $55 million. Frederick William Vanderbilt got his share, and George Washington Vanderbilt, the youngest son and his father's favourite, received what seemed at the time like a perfectly adequate inheritance, about $10 million, plus income from various trusts. For most people, $10 million would be more than enough for several lifetimes. For George Vanderbilt, it would barely be sufficient to complete his dream. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what the 3rd generation of Vanderbilts did with all that wealth, the Gilded Age and its mansions. America in the 1880s and 1890s was experiencing what historians now call the Gilded Age, a time when industrial fortunes created a class of Americans wealthier than European royalty. Mark Twain coined the term in his novel The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today, and the name stuck. It was an era of ostentatious display, where the super-rich competed to outdo each other with increasingly elaborate homes, parties, and possessions. The Vanderbilt siblings led this charge. Cornelius II built a massive townhouse in Manhattan that was the largest private residence ever constructed in the borough. His brothers and sisters built summer cottages in Newport, Rhode Island, though calling them cottages was like calling the Taj Mahal a shed. These were palatial estates designed to showcase wealth and taste. The Vanderbilts also built mansions on Long Island's Gold Coast and in Hyde Park, New York. Each sibling seemed determined to outdo the others. The competition wasn't just about size, it was about demonstrating sophistication, European taste, and cultural refinement. They hired the best architects, imported furnishings from Europe, filled their homes with priceless art. The parties they threw became legendary, with guest lists that read like a who's who of American society. But George Vanderbilt was different from his siblings. Where they sought to impress New York society, George sought something else entirely. He was quiet, even shy, the complete opposite of his grandfather, the brash Commodore. He had been his father's favourite and constant companion, and William Henry had ensured George received the finest education money could buy, though it was all done with private tutors rather than formal schooling. William Henry recognised in his youngest son an intellectual curiosity that deserved cultivation. George was an intellectual in an age when wealthy Americans were often dismissed as uncultured nouveau riches by European aristocracy. He learned French, German, Italian, Spanish, Latin, ancient Greek, modern Greek, Hebrew, Sanskrit, and later several Native American languages. He didn't just learn to speak these languages, he achieved fluency, reading literature and philosophy in the original tongues. He studied art history with the dedication of a scholar, learning to distinguish Renaissance masters from Baroque imitators, understanding the evolution of artistic movements across centuries. He read philosophy voraciously, Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Schopenhauer, wrestling with questions about meaning and beauty that most of his wealthy peers never considered. He travelled extensively, not just to Europe like his siblings, but to Asia and Africa as well. In Paris, he spent weeks in the Louvre and other museums, studying technique and composition. In Japan, he learned about landscape design and the philosophy of harmony with nature. In Egypt, he marvelled at ancient monuments and collected artifacts that museums today would covet. Everywhere he went, he collected paintings by old masters, sculptures from ancient civilizations, rare manuscripts, decorative objects that represented the finest craftsmanship of their eras. By the time he was in his 20s, George's personal library contained over 23,000 volumes in 8 different languages. These weren't just for show. George actually read them, filling margins with notes, discussing them with the intellectuals and artists he befriended during his travels. While his brothers focused on business, expanding the railroad empire, investing in new ventures, managing the massive Vanderbilt financial interests, and his sisters focused on society, throwing balls, cultivating the right friendships, maneuvering their children into advantageous marriages. George immersed himself in culture. He attended lectures, visited artists' studios, corresponded with scholars. He knew he would be financially taken care of for life, even with a smaller share of the family fortune. So instead of pursuing business or social climbing, he pursued knowledge and beauty. His Fifth Avenue townhouse became a personal museum, filled with treasures from around the world that he'd personally selected and could discuss with expertise. He was, in many ways, more European aristocrat than American millionaire. He had the sensibility of someone born to old money and old culture, even though his grandfather had started with a single ferry boat. But George had a problem that all of his education and refinement couldn't solve. He needed to do something meaningful with his life. His siblings all had their grand estates, their business empires, their social triumphs. He needed his own project, his own legacy, something that would justify his existence and demonstrate that wealth could be used for something more than mere display. And in 1888, visiting the mountains of North Carolina with his mother, George Vanderbilt found it, a little mountain escape. George Vanderbilt first visited Asheville, North Carolina, with his mother, Maria Louisa, in the 1880s. The area was beginning to attract wealthy visitors seeking cooler temperatures and mountain air during the brutal southern summers. The scenery captivated George immediately. The Blue Ridge Mountains offered something his siblings' estates didn't: true natural beauty on a massive scale, forest and wilderness as far as the eye could see. George called it his little mountain escape, but he had something far grander in mind than a simple vacation home. He began quietly buying land, and then he bought more. And more. Parcel by parcel, farm by farm, George Vanderbilt assembled an empire of wilderness. By the time he was finished, he owned 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles of mountains, forests and streams. This wasn't just wealthy man's whim. George had studied European estates and understood that great houses needed great landscapes. He wanted to create something that had never existed in America, a true country estate in the European tradition, a self-sustaining community that would preserve both natural beauty and demonstrate advanced scientific farming and forestry. To design his house, George hired Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and the leading architect of the Gilded Age. Hunt had already designed mansions for George's siblings, but nothing prepared him for what George envisioned. They travelled throughout Europe together, visiting French chateaux, Blois, Chenonceau, Chambord, studying Renaissance architecture, and discussing how to adapt European grandeur to the American mountains. For the landscape, George engaged Frederick Law Olmsted, the father of American landscape architecture and designer of New York's Central Park. Olmsted saw immediately that George's vision went far beyond creating a pretty garden. This was to be a managed landscape on an unprecedented scale, combining formal gardens near the house with scientific forestry in the mountains beyond. The scale of what George proposed was almost incomprehensible. The house alone would contain 250 rooms spread across 4 acres of floor space. To visualize that, 4 acres is roughly 3 football fields. That's how much interior space this single house would occupy. It would include 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. More fireplaces than most hotels. The construction would require its own brick kiln producing millions of bricks on site, its own woodworking factory to craft the intricate panelling and trim, and a 3-mile railroad spur just to bring materials to the building site from the main line. About 1,000 workers and 60 stonemasons would labour for 6 years to complete the project, creating what was essentially a small industrial operation just to build one man's house. George spared no expense on technology and comfort. He installed some of Thomas Edison's first electric light bulbs throughout the house. Electricity was still so new that many wealthy homes relied primarily on gas lighting or candles. He added a fire alarm system that was state-of-the-art for its time, an electrical call box system so that servants could be summoned to any room instantly, 2 elevators when most buildings had none, and indoor plumbing for all 34 bedrooms, something still rare even in the finest homes, where chamber pots and outhouses remained common. He installed telephones throughout the building, even though Alexander Graham Bell had only invented the device 2 decades earlier, and most Americans had never used one. For recreation, there would be an indoor swimming pool with underwater lighting, a bowling alley with Brunswick equipment, and a gymnasium with the latest exercise apparatus, amenities that wouldn't become common in wealthy homes for another 50 years. The house would be fully centrally heated using a massive boiler system, something still rare even in the finest homes. Most mansions of the era still relied on individual fireplaces or stoves in each room, meaning servants had to haul coal and wood constantly. George's system would heat the entire house from a central location. Construction began in 1889. While the work progressed in Asheville, George and Hunt continued their European shopping expeditions, purchasing thousands of items. Tapestries from the 16th century depicting biblical scenes and classical mythology. Furniture from every period, medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo, each piece selected for authenticity and craftsmanship. Carpets from Persia and Turkey that had taken weavers years to complete. Paintings by Renoir, Monet and other masters. Porcelains from China and Japan. Bronzes from Renaissance Italy. The house's library alone would hold 10,000 volumes, with a concealed passageway leading to guest rooms and an ornate walnut spiral staircase connecting 2 floors. The grand staircase would be particularly spectacular, 107 steps spiralling around a 4-story wrought-iron chandelier, holding 72 electric light bulbs, all suspended from a single point. The engineering required to make this work was extraordinary, as the chandelier had to be perfectly balanced or it would pull the entire structure down. The banquet hall would feature a 70-foot barrel-vaulted ceiling high enough that sound would echo dramatically, requiring careful acoustic planning. The tapestry gallery would stretch 90 feet, longer than most people's entire houses. Every detail received George's personal attention. He approved every carpet, every piece of furniture, every painting placement. But George's vision extended far beyond the house itself, and that's where the true expense and the ultimate financial problem would emerge. He wanted Biltmore to be self-sustaining, like the great English estates he admired. The property would include farms producing vegetables, fruits and grains, dairies providing milk, cream, butter and cheese, forestry operations that would harvest timber sustainably while demonstrating conservation principles, and even a winery, though that wouldn't be established until decades later. This wasn't just about feeding the household. George envisioned Biltmore's products being sold commercially, generating revenue that would offset the enormous costs of maintaining the estate. He hired experts in every field, paying premium salaries to attract the best talent available. In 1892, on Frederick Law Olmsted's recommendation, George hired a young forester named Gifford Pinchot to manage the estate's woodlands. Pinchot would later become the first chief of the US Forest Service, but at Biltmore, he implemented America's first professionally managed forest. This meant selective cutting rather than clear cutting, replanting programs, fire management, and scientific study of forest ecology. all revolutionary concepts in 1890s America, where most forests were simply logged until nothing remained. George also established the Biltmore School of Forestry in 1898 under Dr. Carl A. Schenck, the first such school in North America. Students came from across the country to learn sustainable forestry practices. This wasn't just a vanity project. George genuinely believed in conservation and scientific land management. He wanted Biltmore to be a model for how Americans could use their land productively while preserving it for future generations. He poured thousands of dollars into forestry research and education that would never generate a profit in his lifetime. He even built an entire village, Biltmore Village, to house the workers and staff who would maintain the estate. It wasn't just worker housing. George designed it as a complete community with workers' cottages that were actually comfortable and attractive, a hospital to care for employees and their families, a school so workers' children could receive education, and All Souls Church, an Episcopal cathedral that George personally funded. He paid all the church's operating expenses so that the weekly collection could go entirely to charity rather than building maintenance. This was paternalism, certainly, but it was paternalism with genuine concern for employee welfare, unusual for the era. On Christmas Eve, 1895, George Vanderbilt opened Biltmore House to his family and friends. The house was actually still unfinished. Work would continue for several more years on various rooms and features. But George wanted to host that first Christmas in his new home. The massive house glowed with candlelight and early electric lights, its towers and turrets silhouetted against the mountain sky. Guests arrived from across the country to celebrate with America's youngest but most cultured member of its richest family. They toured the completed rooms, marveled at the art collection, and celebrated in a house unlike anything America had ever seen. By any measure, Biltmore was an extraordinary achievement. At 175,000 square feet, it remains to this day the largest private residence in the United States. No home built since has matched its scale. George had created something truly unique, a French Renaissance chateau in the American wilderness, surrounded by scientifically managed forests and productive farmland, incorporating the latest technology while displaying centuries-old art and craftsmanship. It was, in every sense, his masterpiece. But masterpieces are expensive to maintain, and George Vanderbilt's fortune, while substantial, was not infinite. The house required an army of servants. Estimates suggest at least 40 to 50 indoor servants, plus dozens more for outdoor work, stables, and grounds. Every one of them needed to be paid, fed, and housed. The estate employed hundreds of workers in forestry, farming, gardening, and maintenance. At peak operation, Biltmore employed over 400 people. The scientific experiments George sponsored in forestry and agriculture were money-losing propositions in the short term, investments in sustainable practices that might pay off eventually, but certainly didn't cover their costs immediately. George's $10 million inheritance, while substantial, was generating perhaps $500,000 to $700,000 per year in investment income at typical rates of return for the era. A fortune for a private family, but barely adequate for maintaining a 125,000-acre estate with a 250-room house and hundreds of employees. The estate's various businesses, farming, forestry, the nursery selling native plants, the dairy operation, were meant to make Biltmore self-sustaining, but they weren't quite achieving that goal yet. They were making money, but not enough to cover the enormous fixed costs of the house and operations. The seeds of Biltmore's financial struggles were planted even as the house was being completed, and those seeds would sprout into an existential crisis when American tax law fundamentally changed. A brief domestic happiness. In June 1898, George Vanderbilt married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris. Edith was descended from Peter Stuyvesant, the first governor of Dutch colonial New York. giving her the kind of old family credentials that New York society valued. She was 25. George was 35. After a quiet honeymoon in Italy, George brought his new bride to Biltmore. The estate's employees lined up along the approach road to welcome their new mistress, creating a giant horseshoe made of goldenrod flowers with the phrase, "Welcome home." It must have been both wonderful and overwhelming for Edith, suddenly finding herself mistress of America's largest private residence with a staff of hundreds, depending on the estate for their livelihoods. On August 22, 1900, Edith gave birth to their daughter, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, in the Louis XVIII room of Biltmore House. It was a celebrated event. The Spartanburg Journal wrote about the birth of a new star at famous Biltmore, describing the charming mistress of this most gorgeous home smiling upon her firstborn. For George and Edith, little Cornelia represented both joy and continuity, an heir to carry on the Biltmore legacy. Cornelia grew up at Biltmore, an only child in a house with 250 rooms. She played with the children of estate workers, attended school in Biltmore Village, and went to church services at All Souls Cathedral with her parents. George was known for his kindness to his employees. Every Christmas, he hosted a celebration for workers' children, with a decorated tree and presents for each child, even those who couldn't attend the party. He paid all expenses for All Souls Church so that weekly collections could go directly to charity. The Vanderbilts lived well but relatively quietly by Gilded Age standards. George was never one for the ostentatious parties that characterized his siblings' lives. He preferred intellectual pursuits, reading in his library, studying his art collection, overseeing the forestry and agricultural experiments on the estate. Edith involved herself in the local community, supporting schools and charitable causes in Asheville. But maintaining Biltmore was extraordinarily expensive. The house required a small army of servants. The estate employed hundreds of workers in forestry, farming, gardening, and maintenance. The scientific experiments George sponsored were money-losing propositions in the short term, investments in sustainable practices that might pay off eventually, but certainly didn't cover their costs immediately. George's $10 million inheritance, while substantial, was generating perhaps $500,000 to $700,000 per year in investment income. A fortune for a private family, but barely adequate for maintaining a 125,000-acre estate with a 250-room house and hundreds of employees. The estate's various businesses, farming, forestry, the nursery selling native plants, were meant to make Biltmore self-sustaining, but they weren't quite achieving that goal yet. And then Congress passed the Income Tax Amendment in 1913, fundamentally changing the economics of maintaining great estates in America. For the first time, wealthy Americans would have to pay taxes on their income, not just on property. The estate that George had built during an era of no income tax suddenly faced a very different financial reality. George began negotiating to sell 80,000 acres of the Pisgah Forest portion of the estate to the federal government. He offered it at a discount, hoping to preserve the forest while bringing in needed cash. But the government moved slowly, and George's financial situation was becoming strained. He needed to sell land, but he also wanted to ensure it would be protected rather than logged and destroyed. In early 1914, George travelled to Washington, D.C. to continue discussions about the land sale and to attend to other business. He left Edith and 13-year-old Cornelia at Biltmore, telling them he'd return soon. He seemed to be in good health, though he'd complained of minor stomach pain. On February 24, 1914, the pain became acute. George sought medical help immediately. Doctors diagnosed appendicitis and told him he needed emergency surgery. George Vanderbilt, age 51, went under the knife in Washington, D.C., far from his mountain home and the family who loved him. The operation appeared successful at first. George rested at the Vanderbilt Washington House, while doctors monitored his recovery. Back at Biltmore, Edith received telegrams with updates. The early messages were encouraging. George was recovering well. The danger had passed. But appendectomies in 1914 were far riskier than modern surgery. Anesthesia was primitive, antibiotics didn't exist, and complications were common. On March 6, 1914, about 10 days after the surgery, George Washington Vanderbilt II died suddenly from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had formed during or after the operation and travelled to his lungs. Medical staff were present, but neither Edith nor Cornelia had time to reach Washington before he passed. George was gone, leaving behind a wife, a 13-year-old daughter, America's largest house, and a financial situation that was far more precarious than most people realised. News of George's death shocked the country. He had been one of America's most prominent citizens, a patron of the arts and sciences, a pioneer in conservation. Local newspapers mourned the loss of Asheville's greatest benefactor. Hundreds of workers and their families suddenly worried about their futures. George was buried in the Vanderbilt family mausoleum on Staten Island, far from the mountains he'd loved and the estate he'd created. The fairy tale was over. Now came the reckoning, the widow's burden. Edith Vanderbilt was 41 years old when her husband died, left with a teenage daughter and an estate that was both priceless and nearly impossible to maintain. In his will, George left the Biltmore estate to 13-year-old Cornelia, with $5 million held in trust until she turned 25. Edith inherited the Washington house and some other properties, but Biltmore itself, the massive house, the remaining land, the hundreds of employees, now belonged to a child. This meant Edith had to manage everything until Cornelia came of age, and Edith immediately understood what George perhaps hadn't fully grasped. Biltmore was an architectural albatross that would require extraordinary financial manoeuvring to survive intact. Edith went to work immediately. Within weeks of George's death, she renewed his offer to sell 86,700 acres of the Pisgah Forest to the federal government. But this time, she reduced the price even further, from $7 per acre to just $5 per acre, accepting $200,000 less than the earlier negotiated amount. In May 1914, the sale went through for $433,500. The land became the foundation of Pisgah National Forest, America's first managed forest preserve east of the Mississippi River. It was both a tribute to George's conservation vision and a financial necessity. The sale reduced Biltmore from 125,000 acres to about 38,000 acres, but it brought in desperately needed cash. Still, it wasn't nearly enough. Maintaining even the smaller estate with its enormous house remained fantastically expensive. Edith consolidated operations, cut costs where possible, and tried to make the remaining estate businesses more profitable. She moved to Washington, D.C. in 1920 to manage her financial affairs and to ensure Cornelia received a proper education and social introduction. The family used Biltmore primarily for holidays and summers, rather than as a full-time residence. In 1924, Cornelia married the Honourable John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British diplomat descended from Lord Burghley, who had been Lord High Treasurer to Queen Elizabeth I. The wedding at All Souls Church was a major social event, with guests from around the world descending on Little Asheville. It seemed like a new chapter for Biltmore, a young couple to carry on George Vanderbilt's legacy. But the American economy was heading toward catastrophe, and the Vanderbilt family fortune was evaporating faster than anyone realised. The empire crumbles. While the Cecils were starting their family, George Henry Vanderbilt. Cecil was born at Biltmore in 1925, followed by William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil in 1928. The Vanderbilt empire was collapsing across the country. The problem was simple. The third and fourth generations of Vanderbilts were spenders. not builders. While Cornelius and William Henry had created and doubled the fortune through business acumen and careful management, their descendants treated wealth as something to be enjoyed rather than preserved. They built more mansions, threw more lavish parties, invested in yachts and racehorses and European art. Some divorced, and divorce settlements cost fortunes. Others made poor investments or simply lived beyond even their substantial means. The railroad empire that had created the Vanderbilt wealth was also in decline. After World War II, the railroad industry faced increasing competition from automobiles, trucks, and eventually airlines. The New York Central Railroad, once the crown jewel of the Vanderbilt holdings, began a long slide toward irrelevance. The family no longer managed it directly. They'd become passive investors, living off dividends rather than actively running the business. By the fourth generation, the Vanderbilts had become society figures, gamblers, and playboys. None of them noticed the fundamental shift in American business away from railroads, and none of them seemed to understand that fortunes, no matter how vast, can be spent down to nothing if enough people are spending and no one is earning. The Great Depression delivered the death blow. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the Vanderbilt fortune took a devastating hit. Suddenly, maintaining vast estates became impossible. Income from investments dried up. Property values collapsed. The era of American country houses was ending, and it was ending violently. By 1930, the Cecils realized they had to do something radical to save Biltmore. On March 15, 1930, they opened the house to paying tourists. Admission was $2, and that first day, 300 people toured America's largest private home. Within a year, nearly 40,000 visitors had walked through the rooms where the Vanderbilts had lived. It was an admission of financial defeat, but it was also Biltmore's salvation. The tourism revenue provided income to maintain the house and grounds. More importantly, it gave Biltmore a purpose beyond being a rich family's plaything. It became part of America's cultural heritage, a place where ordinary people could glimpse how the wealthy had lived during the Gilded Age. But the personal cost to the family was substantial. Cornelia and John Cecil's marriage fell apart under the pressure. They divorced in 1934. Cornelia left Biltmore and never returned, moving to Greenwich Village and then to Paris. She abandoned not just the estate, but her 2 young sons, who were raised primarily by their father. The Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue began falling to the wrecking ball. One by one, those grand townhouses that had been built to last forever were demolished and replaced with apartment buildings and commercial structures. The Newport cottages suffered similar fates. Many were torn down or repurposed. The Vanderbilt empire was being liquidated, sold off piece by piece to cover debts and taxes. In 1970, the New York Central Railroad declared bankruptcy. The company that Cornelius Vanderbilt had built into America's railroad empire was gone. Unlike industries that received government bailouts in later eras, the railroads were simply nationalized for passenger service, becoming Amtrak. The Vanderbilt family's connection to the industry that had created their wealth was severed completely. A family gathering in 1973 at Vanderbilt University illustrated just how complete the collapse had been. Over 120 living Vanderbilt descendants attended. Not one of them was a millionaire. The family that had once been the richest in America was now, at best, comfortably middle class. Some Vanderbilts found success on their own terms. Anderson Cooper through journalism, Timothy Oliphant through acting, John P. Hammond through music. But they achieved that success despite being Vanderbilts, not because of it. The family name carried no financial weight anymore. At Biltmore, the Cecil brothers, George and William, took over management from their father. They divided the estate between them in a way that would determine Biltmore's future. George Cecil, the elder brother, inherited most of the land and the Biltmore Farms Company, which managed agricultural operations. William Cecil inherited Biltmore House itself. It was William who is credited with truly saving Biltmore. He recognised that the house couldn't survive as a private residence. The costs were simply too high. But it could survive as a business, a tourist destination that would preserve George Vanderbilt's creation while generating enough revenue to maintain it. William opened a winery on the estate in 1985, which became America's most visited winery. He developed additional attractions, built inns for overnight guests, created shops and restaurants. Today, over 1 million people visit Biltmore every year. Tickets start at around $90. The house and remaining 8,000 acres are valued at over $150 million, though the true value as a tourist destination is much higher. The estate remains owned by George Vanderbilt's descendants, the Cecil family, and remains the largest privately owned home in America. But it's no longer really a home. It's a business, a museum, a tourist attraction. It survives by opening its doors to anyone with the price of admission, by hosting weddings and conferences, by selling wine and hotel rooms and Christmas ornaments. The Cecils live elsewhere. The house that George Vanderbilt built as a private family retreat is now public property in everything but name. The lesson of Biltmore. The story of Biltmore and the Vanderbilt family is often told as a morality tale about the dangers of wealth and excess. And there's certainly truth to that reading. Cornelius Vanderbilt built a fortune through intelligence and ruthlessness. William Henry preserved and grew it through careful management, but the third and fourth generations squandered it through extravagance and neglect, mistaking wealth for competence and assuming their fortune would last forever. But Biltmore's story is more complex than simple moral parable. George Vanderbilt wasn't a wastrel or a fool. He was a thoughtful, educated man who genuinely believed in conservation and scientific land management. He built Biltmore not just for personal enjoyment, but as a model estate that would demonstrate American forestry and agriculture could be both productive and sustainable. The tragedy is that his vision was ahead of its time, but too expensive for even a Vanderbilt fortune to sustain. In an era before income taxes, maintaining a 100 to 25,000 acre estate with a 250-room house was difficult but possible for America's richest family. Once income taxes and economic depression struck, it became impossible. Biltmore survives today only because the family was willing to transform it from a private home into a public attraction. That transformation saved the building and grounds, but it fundamentally changed what Biltmore was. George Vanderbilt's dream of a self-sustaining country estate in the European tradition died with him. What remains is something else, a monument to Gilded Age ambition, a museum of American excess, a business that happens to be housed in a magnificent building. The Vanderbilt Empire didn't really die. It fragmented and evolved. The railroad fortune that Cornelius built is gone, but Vanderbilt University endures. The Fifth Avenue mansions were destroyed, but some Newport properties survive as museums. And Biltmore stands, perhaps the family's most lasting legacy, visited by millions who marvel at its size and beauty while learning about both the triumphs and the limits of American wealth. The house that George Vanderbilt called his Little Mountain Escape has become a symbol of both achievement and decline, a reminder that even the largest fortunes are temporary, and that buildings outlast the families who build them only when they serve some purpose larger than private luxury. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.